Welcome to Keepers of the Word. We're an esoteric study group of Freemasons. Our purpose is to share knowledge of mystery schools and debunk any misconceptions about Masonry. You're here with Ron and James, and today our special guest is P.D. Newman, Brother P.D. Newman, author of the book. Yeah, I know, I did lots of research. Alchemically Stoned, the psychedelic secret of Freemasonry. Thanks for joining us today, brother. We really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
Really appreciate it.
So where are you hailing from this morning?
I'm in Tupelo, Mississippi, on our family farm here, taking refuge from the sun this morning. It's already almost 85 out there. So it's hot today.
Oh, wow. Yeah, stay inside, right?
Yeah.
It's really hot over here in California. I think it's about 75.
Oh, that's so nice.
We got overcast here next to the coast, so
where are you?
Our natural AC's kicked in. I'm in San Pedro, so just across from Long Beach for these guys.
He's in San Pedro. Yeah, I'm in Long Beach.
Gotcha. I spent a little bit of time up in Northern California around in a town called Hayfork.
Cool.
Where at?
Hayfork. It's up close to Mount Shasta, that area.
It's a beautiful area.
Okay.
Really?
Yeah, that's nice.
Rough area.
So this rabbit hole that you went down with the book, how did you go down that rabbit hole?
It's a big rabbit hole.
What took you there?
Yeah.
It's a big rabbit hole.
Well, before I was interested in Freemasonry, I was very interested in psychedelics, and was really looking at investigating the mystical side of it, the ritual use of it. But at the same time, my own experience with it, I didn't really have any kind of guides. We don't have elders in our community that walk us through those kinds of rites of passage. And I felt like I was kind of out of my element. And at that point, I thought, maybe I should search out a more traditional rite of passage that might give me a grip on some of the more kind of out there things I was undergoing on certain psychedelics like DMT and mushrooms and LSD and mescaline. I mean, we were experimenting with anything that you would call a psychedelic, a hallucinogen, pretty heavily. And it got kind of, like I said, I kind of got out of my element with my experiences. So I'd had family members who were Freemasons, and in the South, Freemasons are a very popular thing. So I turned to Freemasonry as a sort of rite of passage that would give me a framework by which to interpret this stuff. And it was only to my surprise that I encountered the sprig of acacia when I became a Master Mason. And in my experience, when we were experimenting with DMT, we were extracting it from acacia. So of course my ears perked up real high. And I thought, surely this is, I'm just reading into this. This is just a coincidence. And I set that aside and kind of wouldn't let that curiosity arouse me too much because, I wanted to experience Masonry for what it was, not project my own stuff into it. And so, yeah, I just kind of left that alone. And it wasn't until several years later that I was reading the rituals of a man named Alessandro di Cagliostro, who created something called the Egyptian Rite of Freemasonry. And in it, he specifically had candidates drinking acacia, drinking an alchemical tincture or elixir prepared from acacia. And he tells them in the ritual that the sprig of acacia you were given in the ordinary degree of Master Mason was this prima materia, and from it we extract the philosopher's stone, and that's what you're drinking now, et cetera, et cetera. So right there, plainly in your face, was this, clearly not symbolic, a literal drinking of acacia in a ritual. So of course, you couldn't set that aside easily. There's no other reason than an entheogenic one, in my in my estimation, why they would be drinking acacia at all. And when you read in the ritual the effects that Cagliostro attributes to this elixir, it's in keeping with low to moderate doses of DMT, dimethyltryptamine, which is in acacia. It's certain species of acacia have it in their root bark primarily. But so yeah, once I saw that, I said, well, I have to seriously kind of consider the fact that it might have been put here for that reason in the first place. And that's how, the book came about, was me trying to research that.
That's awesome. Yeah, I personally, I think I got introduced to the whole DMT discussion from Rick Strassman's movie, the Spirit Molecule, and he talks about how it's in so many different places in nature, and that the acacia is one of the largest. The acacia bark or roots is one of the largest sources of DMT. And as soon as I heard that, I immediately did the exact same thing. I'm like, if we're a mystery school, if we have symbolism within our craft, why would you put the sprig of acacia if it didn't have some type of ethnogenic message to it?
For sure.
So.
Yeah, I agree. I think so too. And once I started investigating the history of it, I didn't get this far in Alchemically Stoned simply because the information wasn't available to me at the time. But in my new book, my forthcoming book, Angels in Vermilion, I was able to trace the lineage by which this entered into Freemasonry. And it happened through the Royal Society, through certain members of the Royal Society who believed that a couple of Elizabethan era maguses and alchemists named Dr. John Dee and Sir Edward Kelly, they believed that they were using this red powder to communicate with angels. And them being, of the scientific mental persuasion, they immediately said, well, if he's using a physical substance to communicate with non-physical entities, then it must be a drug. And that sends Boyle and the entire Royal Society on this pursuit of psychedelic drugs that was actually published by the Royal Society in 2010, something called Boyle's Wish List. And it's a list of everything he wants to acquire for them to study. And it's all drugs. He says he wants hallucinogenic drugs, drugs that cause pleasing dreams, that cause epileptic fits, drugs that cause fits of strength. He's looking for what allowed them to talk to angels. He's trying to find it. And so it's from that background, that kind of inquisitive, what you call pharmacognosistic background, looking for drugs and plants, that this man named John Theophilus de Sagulier, who is the third Grand Master of the premier Grand Lodge in London, it's the background from which he emerged when he became Grand Master. He was research assistant to Sir Isaac Newton in the Royal Society, investigating psychedelics.
Right.
So, and not just any psychedelics. He specifically says he's looking for a fungus that's mentioned by a French author. There's a lecture given by Robert Hooke, who was Isaac Newton's arch nemesis, on some hashish his buddy brought him back, and he tried it and talks about how it gave him the munchies and made him passed out. Like so it's not like the acacia appeared in Freemasonry in a vacuum. Before it was acacia, you look at the older rituals, there's no mention of acacia. It's a mention of a sprig of cassia. And there's an argument that it's just pronounced differently, that cassia is acacia minus the initial letter, what's called a lyciad, whenever you leave the initial letter off of a word. So acacia becomes cassia. But that doesn't really hold up because cassia is already a thing. It's mentioned in the Bible as a cinnamon-like spice that's used in embalming. You can buy it in grocery stores today. So it wasn't until after de Sagulier shows up as Grand Master that all of a sudden cassia becomes acacia in every lodge in Europe. Every single expose you find after de Sagulier was Grand Master, cassia becomes acacia. And Dr. David Harrison, who wrote The Genesis of Freemasonry, The Lost Rites of Freemasonry, he argues that it was de Sagulier who made that change, who put that sprig of acacia in there. And like I said, we know what background he came from.
Yeah.
And we know what ends it was used by Cagliostro just a couple of decades later.
So can you talk a little bit about Cagliostro? I think I actually found, I was looking to try to incorporate some type of ethnogen into a ceremony, especially something Masonically. And I saw your book and then started doing the research on Cagliostro. And yeah, that's when I was like, okay, so there's already something that's there and written. So how can we get that?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, he was a mystic. He was a healer. He was an alchemist. He was imprisoned for heresy and died while imprisoned. But his ritual he created isn't like, it's a lot of people conflate it with the rituals of Memphis and Mizraim. It's not those. Those are equally Egyptoid. I'm reluctant to say Egyptian because they're not actually Egyptian. They're Egyptian styled, but they're not actually Egyptian rituals. Cagliostro's Egyptian rite was founded in London. So, but even though they style themselves Egyptian, Cagliostro's was very different from theirs because his was just a 3-degree system. He was redoing masonry. He wasn't doing like hive masonry. And even though he limited it to people who were already master masons, unless they were women. And then they had a separate rite they went through under a female hierophant or priestess who went by the name of Queen of Sheba ceremonially. And I'm not sure if that ritual was identical or tweaked some for females, but the bottom line was his was a 3-degree system. And in it, it's hard to determine if he's transvaluating the sprig of acacia, to borrow like a Nietzschean term, taking it and making it be something else, appropriating it to a hallucinogen, because we don't see it used in a hallucinogenic context before Cagliostro and Melissino. Melissino, we see it before Cagliostro, actually. Melissino was a Pyotr Ivanovich Melissino was a Russian artilleryman and an alchemist, and he claimed to have learned the secret from a German doctor named Johann Kerstens, who was the first doctor of chemistry at Moscow University. And he basically gives the same recipe that Cagliostro gives in his ritual on how to extract from the prima materia, aka the acacia, this philosopher's stone, and then how to apply it ceremonially, and how to get this common result between the two. And what's interesting is both of them knew each other. They were colleagues. When, I don't know if you're familiar with the whole diamond necklace affair, Falconelli story, but when he went to Russia, he met with Melissino. Melissino was his contact. So this stuff, it's hard to say who got it from who, where it came from, but it looked like it was being passed around within certain circles, specifically alchemically inclined circles within Freemasonry.
Awesome.
Almost like a double trust system, huh? Like they wanted to keep it with people that they knew they could trust as alchemists and as masons as well, huh?
Well, and you got to keep in mind too the time at which this was taking place. There was no war on drugs. There was no real knowledge of addiction outside of alcoholism and some knowledge of opium addiction coming out of laudanum use and stories in India. There was no big addiction problem. And so drugs weren't viewed with the kind of negativity they are now. And especially a drug that would induce visions. You got to keep in mind, for these people, it would have been like Jamie Paul Lamb argues in the foreword to my new book. He says they would have interpreted this as a revelation, as like Ezekiel, or in terms of John of Patmos. This would have been earth-shattering visions that they would have reserved specifically for people that they, I think, would have appreciated them for what they were. It wasn't just an idle curiosity or tripping out or let's get high. It was a very spiritual. For example, when Melissino used it, he only used it in the 7th and final degree of his system, which had to take place in a church. And he saw it as a religious act,
Sacred.
Right.
It really is. And really it's hard to, as someone who has experienced psilocybin, to try to have conversations with someone who hasn't is pretty pointless, because you know, even just the descriptions you give, like, I remember coming back my first time and talking with people about it, and I was like, I communicated with plants, and they're like, so did you talk to them? And I'm like,
you don't have
to. Talk is such a weird word. The closest thing I came to was that there was an exchange of information. There was some type of, absolutely, there was a I got something that the plant was sharing with me, and I gave something, you know, it was definitely
you heard with your feelings.
What's that?
You heard with your feelings.
I guess, whatever. But yeah, and people are like, okay, whatever. Yeah, you talk to plants.
Yeah.
Like,
you know, and you mentioned things like boundary dissolution and, you know, ego death phenomena. And it's hard to imagine in a state with no experience, much less communicate what that would be like.
I was going to ask you, what do you think I know personally, but you know, you did research on this. I want the viewers to kind of get an idea, the difference between having experience with psilocybin, ayahuasca, or some transcendental hallucinogen, an experience of you in your backyard in a pretty garden versus a ceremonial setting. Can you kind of explain the difference of that and the importance of that as well?
Yeah, well, they both have their place.
Yes.
There's a lot to be said for just taking the medicine, I hate to. I usually don't say medicine. I try to say sacrament. But in this context, I'm trying to say if it's needed to be used to remedy a situation, you know, a lot of times just sitting there to taking it and accepting it for what it is, which is you, accepting you for what you are, really. You know, there's nothing in the plant. It's all you. It's pulling you out.
Yes.
But for certain ends, just being, surrendering is enough. We humans don't know how to surrender, and just to be able to surrender and say okay to an experience and allow it to happen, that's a huge step. And when we're talking about ceremonially using these things in a ritual, and when I say ritual, I mean a series of steps designed for an outcome. You know, the ceremony becomes it's your control panel. Your altar becomes a sort of control panel, is the way a lot of magicians talk about it, and they're right.
Yes.
But what the rituals do is they keep you focused, and you'll see it in a lot of the modern churches that incorporate these kind of sacraments, like the Santo Daime. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And the União do Vegetal, the UDV, that use ayahuasca. You'll notice they do it in singing and standing up and doing these dances. Lights are on, very focused. You don't leave the room. And
no.
Whereas if you take it in a more traditional setting, in the jungle, they do it in total darkness. And you'll hear Terence McKenna talk about silence and darkness and earplugs, no music. You know, these are fundamentally different ways to approach it. One is the surrender, and the other is willpower, is saying, I want to use this to become something else, to change myself, or to change reality and conformity with something else. And in that sense, the ritual becomes, like I said, it becomes the template by which you interpret the experience. And it sounds silly, but it's or at least trivial from someone who's not familiar with the deep psychological results that come from ritual. But just having a simple ritual set up, even something as simple as bathing, meditating, reciting a simple mantra, lighting a candle, and then closing your eyes and letting it happen. Have it just setting an intention. It's amazing how we script our experiences. Not just with psychedelics. Every day we wake up and script our day and don't realize it. When you take psychedelics, you have an opportunity to see firsthand how fast your scripting works and happens. That's what magic really is, in my opinion. You know, scripting your experience.
I'll say, as a experienced psychonaut myself, that is probably the best description and definition I've ever heard. That hits a T, because I've done both, sitting in your backyard in a beautiful environment, and like you said, just learning what the sacrament can do for you, and then discovering your true self, what's going to come out of you, and then to do it in a ceremonial setting where you have direction, you have a focus point, where the music, the singing brings you along, keeps you focused on what your intentions were that you set, or that you asked in prayer, or anything like that before doing the ceremony. Two vastly different perspectives, but both are really needed. First you have to do that self-discovery, and okay, this is who I am when everything comes away. This isn't the James walking down the street. This is the James who's at home eating a bag of chips, watching TV, meeting yourself like that. And then in a ceremonial aspect, we have direction, and it's you taking that self and growing, expanding yourself in a self-determined direction. So that was a really amazing definition. Best one I've actually ever heard.
I think maybe another benefit of the rituals ceremony situation can also be, if it's your first time doing something, like the very first time that you take ayahuasca or something like that, it can be a really frightening experience because you don't know what to expect.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of the benefit of that ritual situation is that it's almost like the shaman will have control of the whole journey for you, other than what's going on with you taking the sacrament, and what's going to go on with your mind and your healing and all of that. But the whole setting is being very controlled, and the music keeps things moving along. It almost changes like scenes of a movie, or like different acts of a play or something like that every time a song stops, and it takes the waves. So
you're in a incredibly suggestive state, and that's scary to some people too. You're in a position where as Christopher Timmerman, I think his name is, just did a study on brain imaging and DMT, but determined his basic takeaway from it was that taking DMT is like dreaming, but with your eyes open.
Yes.
And you know how it is when you're dreaming, you experience a nightmare. Unless you're lucid and can snap out of it, you're not gonna know you're having a nightmare. You're gonna be in that experience, and those lines blur when you enter what's called the third stage of trance. When you enter that stage where you're interacting with, and that's where the magic really takes place too.
Pure magic. But
once that stuff starts taking place, you're psychologically in a position to where you can no longer determine, unless you're skilled at it and can navigate the territory, or have a guide there that can work through it, reality from fiction. And that takes us back to every day, in the backs of our minds, just behind the skylit theaters in here, is a backdrop of shadowy movements and things that influence us throughout the day, that push us one way or another, secret drives and impulses and motivations, and all that stuff comes to the fore furthermore. But I could go on and on this stuff, man.
Yes, this is a big rabbit hole that should be well researched, for sure. I was gonna say, out of all the avenues that you can take for journey, what do you think is the one that what's your favorite, and then what is one that you think should be more widely used and widely accepted for all the many different aspects that it has, all the different properties, the benefits?
My favorite entheogen?
Yes.
It's hard to say a favorite, because like a lot of times the experiences are difficult. So I can't always say I like them. I say they work, but I don't always like them. So it's hard to say a favorite. But the one that works the best for me tends to be psilocybin mushrooms. I grew up in the South, and Psilocybin mushrooms grow all over the place, and grain-fed cow pastures here, and ever since my preteen, I've been navigating that space and kind of making that ally, and I've gotten just amazing personal results from it. But that being said, all of them have their place. They all kind of work on different sides of the psyche, even though, like, for example, they all might work on the serotonin receptors, like all the true hallucinogens like mescaline, peyote, DMT, LSD. But they all have their own little nuances to them. In DMT, even for psilocybin, chemically is 4-phosphoryloxy N and DMT, meaning it is DMT. It's just nature's orally active form of DMT that doesn't need an MAOI to make it work when you take it. So that is DMT, but those experiences, those realms are vastly different. The psilocybin realm for me is very alien and cold and intellectual, and whereas the DMT experience is something completely different. It's something more for me, almost like a return to oceanic kind of womb bliss feeling, and I'll get inklings of that on psilocybin, but with DMT, I don't tend to get the interaction with entities that most people. I get this complete disillusion into what I could only describe as just boundaryless oceanic bliss. And I've read psychological theories that say that this is a return to womb consciousness. Groff talks about this, natal consciousness, and Sigmund Freud's psychiatrist Otto Rank, he wrote a book about birth trauma where he talked about the belief that some of these states were a recovery of the mental state attained in the womb. And I can't say whether that's true or not, but I can definitely say that the analogy is fitting. It fits to describe the experience. But psilocybin would have to be my favorite.
Awesome.
I heard you talking on another podcast about taking high doses of DMT without the MAOI. What was that experience like versus do you normally smoke it or do you do like ayahuasca or something like that?
COPD, so smoking it is difficult for me. That's how I've primarily done it. But these days I don't really, since my son was born, I haven't really experimented or done any ceremonies. I've just been kind of focused on being a parent. But back when I was using DMT regularly, we were smoking it. And smoking it is vastly different than eating it.
Yeah.
If you take ayahuasca with an MAOI, number one, for me, the nausea is brutal. Lots of people, you hear about it being the purge, la purga, because people throw up, have diarrhea. I tend to have the second, and it's not pleasant.
Oh, man.
But the thing is MAOI. The DMT doesn't do that. You can take just pagan hormone by itself, and you'll get that same effect. And it's not pleasant. It just wreaks havoc on the guts. But but some say that that's part of the healing mechanism, that it's doing work in there. And you do purge. People have purged things that you don't see coming out of human bodies often. They just absolutely parasitic looking things, But whenever you take it without the MAOI, even though we had taken massive amounts, because we kept upping our dose, trying more and more to see if we could get any result, because we had heard from an alchemist named J. Eric Laporte, who owns a Ayurvedic pharmaceutical company in India, that he had figured out a way to overwhelm the MAOI with this DMT by just taking way more than you have to. So it's wasteful to do this, but at the same time, it's important to show that it works, because in this literature, in Cagliostro and Mendocino, they don't mention an MAOI. They don't talk about mixing it with anything else. They just say the sprig of acacia. Now, of course, they could have the secret of how to prepare it behind closed doors, reserved for
their members. Yeah.
Another level of whatever consists of, but they don't mention it. So it was important for us to experiment and determine whether or not this was possible. So that being said, I did get an effect, but I did not get an effect like I got with ayahuasca or smoking DMT. I got a very physical buzz. I got a very lightheadedness. I got what felt like the onrush of smoking DMT, but at no point did I feel like I was tripping. I felt very uncomfortable, if you want to know the truth. For a couple of hours, I felt the most anxiety I've ever felt in my whole life, but never did I break through. And that's common with some psychedelic experiences anyway. If you don't take enough to break through, you just sit there on that hum and vibrate, and that can be pretty unnerving. But that's as far as I got with it.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's funny that you say favorite, because I thought the exact same thing when I did Aya. Was when people asked me about it, so tell me about your experience. How was it? I'm like, okay, the very first thing I always tell people, it wasn't fun.
Right.
I loved
It wasn't fun, but it was massively useful, and it was helpful, and it did things. Immense
Yeah,
things.
Immensely.
But yeah, not fun.
I'll say, like, for my journey, the first sip, waited, and other participants were fully participating, and I wasn't. And I just sat there, I was meditating, I had my intention set, and I could feel more of a body, and I'm like, okay, so it's starting to kick in, but it wouldn't happen. And even the shamans were like looking over, and they're like, look at this guy, man. He's all there. And then he kind of came over, and they're like, are you experiencing anything? And I go, no, just my body. And they're like, that's not, like, you took quite a substantial amount. And I'm like, I'm ready for my second sip. And they're like, wow, okay, how much, And I said, I would like the same amount. They're like, just to let you know, once you take the second one, everything will change. And I'm like, I'm looking for, like you said earlier, that breakthrough. Like I'm pretty well versed in this realm, so I want to do enough to have a breakthrough. And I did a second one, and then the first one kicked in.
Yeah, that's how it goes.
I was like, great, this is great. And then the other participants are participating, and I'm pretty normal. And then the first one kicked in. I'm like, great, I just did the second sip, and this is going to be a long journey, but it was beautiful. And then I was really worried because I couldn't purge. I wanted to purge. I knew it was part of it, and
not everyone does.
Yeah, I couldn't purge until the very end. And then on one thing.
You stuck to the diet really, really well too. I believe the diet plays another role. And I know you say the MAOIs just mess with your gut, but I think the diet definitely helps to play a role in the effects, because you're going to get some nausea. You're taking stuff into your body that is just, really,
I didn't have any of it.
Yeah. My shaman said that there wasn't always a physical purge, but sometimes there was emotional or spiritual. And because he said there was like 3 or 4 different paths that grandmother Aya usually takes you down. And for me personally, my purge was emotional. So I shed a lot of tears during mine, but
I had some of that as well. They would just come out on their own. I'm like, what is this? That was amazing. And then there was times where, you're going up and down, and but I finally, when I was able to purge, I was so happy. It finally kicked in when I finally stood up and the ceremony was over. They were like, on a scale of 1 to 10, where are you at in your journey right now? I was like 55. They're like, oh, okay, let's sit down. There was like 8 of them just going around like this. But when I stood up to try to walk outside into the desert, then that's when the emotion hit me. And I was like, oh, finally I feel it, like I'm ready, because I wanted to have that part of the experience as well, to have the purge. And once it happened, I'm pretty good at purging physically like that. So it just happened and got right back to it. I was like, great, I feel great. What do you guys want now? And it was like, what the heck? But it's a wonderful experience. The ayahuasca was by far my favorite. And I had results on all of them, but the ayahuasca was 100% interactive. And that I wasn't ready for. And I was like, how can this be possible to be that interactive and to find answers that I didn't know? I mean, I was Googling stuff afterwards, like, how do I know that? Like, it's an amazing,
The
I have
effect
benefits.
when I take ayahuasca and I really get enough for it to get in there, the sensation I get is that something far more intelligent than me is
There.
working me like a puzzle, and it's opening up every little crack and sweeping shit out and making it fit back together snug, you know. And it's I really get this sensation that something is in my body,
Yeah.
conscious, you know. And I'm a psychological guy. I'll adopt the spirit model when I'm in that state and I'm convinced that that's the model I need to adopt. But most of the time when I'm like in this kind of detached, sober kind of state, I'm a psychological guy. You know, I look at that stuff as me projecting, and a part of me, I'm sensing, you know, there's what would we call it? A detachment of part of my psyche, a mobilization and projection. And but that's not what it feels like when you're on it. It's a very specific, unique feeling that something is aware of you and it's inside you, and it's
I wasn't ready for that.
It's unnerving for me.
It was a little bit, because like you said, like, I'm a really logical guy. So I'm sitting there, I'm like, okay, these are the feelings. I'm going through my little checklist. And all of a sudden it's like something that wasn't me was like, well, you forgot that checklist. Okay, thank you. Like, wait, what? What the heck? And like you start interacting and it's like, wait a minute, that's not me. Like, I'm not doing that. Is that not me, or what's going on?
There's all these theories about that. You know, McKenna talked a lot about the voice that happens on psilocybin and ayahuasca. They're tryptamines. It's a tryptamine phenomenon where this other kind of happens. And, you know, he talked about at one point this book by a man named Julian Jaynes called The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. But it was basically, his theory was that for ancient Greeks, that the corpus callosum wasn't completely formed like it is for us, and that whenever one portion of the brain communicated, the other portion of the brain interpreted as a second person. And this is why people would hear more often back then the voice of God and voices following daemons, geniuses that they would have with them that would inform them throughout the day, and why we don't have that now. But yeah, it's a fascinating phenomenon, because when you experience it, there's no question about the uniqueness of it.
It's very
not
clear.
Yeah, it's like there's something fuck. Yeah.
Yes. Good times. Good times.
But Terence McKenna, he was talking to Albert Hoffman, who discovered the psychedelic effects of LSD, and I don't remember the exact quote, but he says something to the effect of, what do you prefer, LSD or psilocybin? Because he not only did he discover the psychedelic effects of LSD, he also synthesized psilocybin. So he said, which do you prefer? Or LSD, what do you prefer? And McKenna says, well, I prefer mushrooms, because it feels like something's there with me. And Hoffman says, well, that's why I don't like mushrooms, because there is something in there.
Times. I want to go journey right now.
No. What time is it? 9:30?
9:45. It's all good. It's time for it. I like doing sunrise ceremonies, man. That's the most beautiful thing you can see.
That's the first time I've
with nature. Yeah.
understood what the word worship meant, was when I watched the sunrise after a trip. It's tears streaming down my face.
Oh, for sure. One of the best experiences I've ever had. It was with LSD, and it was sitting on top of a hill in San Pedro and looking over the LA harbor with the sun coming up, and the clouds just lit on fire. And it was a living, breathing painting. I just sat there, and I was so like taken back. I was crying, And the person I was with, I was like, man, I hope they don't see me crying. And I look over and they're just bawling. I'm like, okay. They see yeah, it's like you can feel the colors and how beautiful it was. But I'll never forget that. I know
Yeah.
once I experienced that, I'll go, this is it, man. I want to see these journeys and experience this. And what really is this? Like, I don't want to just sit in the backyard and, oh, look at me. I would really want to be serious about it and see what I can attain from this.
Yeah, they're sacred.
Crazy, yeah.
Visions are sacred, and we need to treat them like that. The entire Judeo-Christian model is predicated upon visions people had.
Yes.
All of a sudden, we just dismiss them like they're hallucinations, but they should be treated as, I think, as sacred forms of art, studied. Like a book is studied. They not only do they tell us something about us, they tell us something about our entire people and our place in the universe and deity, and it's just the kind of stuff that comes to the fore during these journeys. It's right up there with some of the highest philosophy you'd ever read, and you're getting it uneducated from, like we said, another. Sometimes a voice is dictating to you. I mean, the absolute most transcendental philosophy that you have ever encountered, and it's right there in your own head, watching the sunrise. It's amazing.
It's truly an experience. I personally believe just about every human being should have a capability of experiencing it, an opportunity to do so. I think it's life altering. I think a lot of people will be doing a lot of different things or viewing life very differently if they did have a professional experience, in a controlled area where they can have a really good experience. I think it would change the lives of many people and their outlook on life and humanity.
Yeah. Well, not to bash on any branches of religion or Christianity or anything like that, but I was raised Southern Baptist, which for me did not have an element of worship to it. I had no idea what worship meant. Like I said before, never really understood that word until I took a psychedelic. And then it dawned on me that I was worshiping in a state of worship. And I think that's what a lot of people in our culture are missing: worship. Just a genuine state of being in awe of the universe and our existence, and
being in the presence of true divinity.
Yeah.
You didn't. I also grew up in a Southern Baptist church, and the same thing. I saw a lot of politics. I saw a lot of things that went against the teachings that were supposedly being inculcated into us, and that's why I got out of it. And I tell people all the time, I found the beginning of what you're saying, worship, within Masonry. I found true brotherhood. I found fellowship. I found a space to be able to find my own spirituality and connect with divinity. And
Absolutely. Masonry has a way of kind of removing all the superfluities so that you just kind of get a simple picture of the base truth of the base problem: man and God. The brotherhood naturally extends from that, and our place in the world. But Masonry has this ability to strip it down and just say, what can we all agree on here that is the dilemma? And it's man and God, and how do we act with each other and in the world, without any dogma, without any, Masonry says it's not a religion, and it's not, but it's definitely spiritual.
It's a framework for that, absolutely.
Oh, definitely.
So what would you say?
Magic is spiritual.
What would you say is going back to your book, the acacia plant? What is its purpose in Freemasonry? Well, you've gone and you discovered the DMT aspect in it. What would you say its function? I mean, this is just a hypothetical, for argument's sake. And we're not gonna give away any secrets, but what do you think its place is in Freemasonry with the knowledge that you have from your book? What would you say it's its place?
Gnosis. And I'll say that because in the ritual, what do they say specifically? That the acacia represents innocence and the immortality of the soul. Right? So in the immortality of the soul, because it's an evergreen, we're told. But how do you prove that? You know, granted, you have to already believe in certain ideas before you can become a Freemason. But when they say that in the ritual, that you have an immortal soul, how can they demonstrate that for you? You can only accept that on faith. But if you experienced it in out of body experience, what OBE is as it's called, and saw firsthand that your consciousness wasn't limited to being in your physical body, and whether or not you're actually leaving your body or not, because it's not the point, because that's the sensation. That's how these people would have interpreted the experience. So when they say that that this represents the immortality of the soul, and then they show you by taking it that you have an experience of transcending matter or the bodily frame, showing that there's some continuity of consciousness beyond death, which is what the visionary experience is very much like, traveling through the heavens. You know, you read the book of Enoch, you read Ezekiel, all these heavenly journeys, leaving the body. Sometimes they'll have the body with them. You know, sometimes you'll read visions where the severed head is carried along with them. But the basic idea is a flight, a shamanic flight, a visionary, you know. So I think the ultimate purpose of it is to provide gnosis of that fact, to say, do you believe in God? Do you believe in the immortality of the soul? Right on. Let's see them. Let's show what we've interpreted to be the experience of those things. And what happens then is gnosis sets in. There's no need for faith once gnosis sets in, because you have knowledge. Nothing can shake that. Now, I say nothing. You know, there's always the Cartesian demon of doubt that could step in and say, well, maybe you didn't experience that. Maybe it was a hallucination or a dream, or maybe you're fudging your memory a little bit, or maybe it's wishful thinking and you were just on a drug, or any of this stuff. But that's where, again, faith has to come back in, and you have to have faith in your gnosis and say, no, I had that. At that moment, I knew. I might not know now, but at that moment, I knew.
It's like you said earlier about letting go and having that experience. To let go of that doubt, just to let go and go for the ride and take it for what it is.
In the moment, absolutely. You know, afterwards, definitely, you know, have some rationale, some analysis.
Sure.
Look at it as an object, objectify it some, but at the same time, I mean, in those moments, I don't care whether any of the listeners believe in God or the soul or not, in those moments, they are real. You know there is a God. You know there is a soul. You know there are spiritual forces. Right here, I could doubt it all day long, but in those moments, I knew, and I have faith in that gnosis, and that's what fuels it. I think that's the real beauty of it, is once you've had it, you'll never forget it. It changes your consciousness forever. You can't expand something and shrink it back down. When we're talking about consciousness, you never go backwards when you've been initiated into something like this. And it also shows what's possible. You know, it says, all right, let's say this is an end game. What you just experienced, now do it without the drug, because it's possible. There are techniques to induce anything that you can do on a drug, you can do off of it. And one example I use of this in my book is MDMA. Just something as simple as forgiveness. You know, I remember having an arch enemy growing up. This guy that if I could have just got my hands on him, I would have torn him to shreds, man. But the first time I took a hefty dose of MDMA, it hit me that if I could see him right then, all I could do was hug him and tell him, thank you for teaching me something about myself. And within that state that I had to be like, why can't I think like this when I'm sober? What's different? You know, and difference is just that subtle transmutation. It's not always something we can do, but sometimes there is something we can do, you know. And magic, I think this is magical territory, getting into really being able to, I hate to say manipulate, but dance with this stuff, you know.
It's definitely shows the medicine characteristics of the sacraments when you can take something away from it, especially if it's something to that effect of someone that you just hated so much that why can't I just love them? I mean, clearly that's a medicine that's helping you heal something within yourself. I mean, obviously you're doing the work,
But forgiveness happened in me. Why did it take a medicine? Why did it take a substance? And it did. I'm not saying it shouldn't have taken a substance. It took a substance, but now it's time for me to figure out how do I do that?
Yeah.
It's possible. If it's so trivial that I can flip it on and off with a drug, then it's trivial, and my emotions aren't that important. We can work on that stuff, and it's possible. It gives me hope.
For sure.
Awesome.
Hey, I got a question. I saw one of the lines in the book, Pythagoras' hecatomb.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that. I'm very curious.
Well, okay, so it's weird anyway. You encounter this in the ritual where they tell you that Pythagoras discovered his theorem and sacrificed a hecatomb. Well, a hecatomb is 100 bulls, right? Well, 100.
And he was a vegetarian.
That's right. Strict
so
vegetarian.
Why would you do that?
But avidly spoke out against animal sacrifice and ritual. So why would they do that? What does that mean? It's obviously wrong, and we know it's wrong because they tell us he screamed eureka upon his discovery. He didn't scream that. Euripides did when he discovered how to find out if gold was actually gold through displacement by placing it in the water when he was in the bathtub. Jumps out naked, running through the streets. Eureka, I found it, So anybody who's studied the early days of science and they hear this from the Pythagoras story in the ritual, is automatically going to say, well, that's not true. And he was a vegetarian. So when you're faced with stuff like this in ritual that's blatantly wrong, what it is an invitation to look deeper and say, what's going on here? And this is one of the most complex things going on in the ritual. And it's often overlooked because of its complexity. But if you read in Porphyry was a philosopher. He was an initiate of the Eleusinian mysteries. But he said those in the know that Pythagoras' bull was made of flour. And so when you started investigating this tradition of flour bulls, there's this tradition of sacred bulls, and where bulls are treated as a theramorphization of the crops, of grains. So they'll take this bull, they'll scatter him with oats. You see it in the Iliad, Homer's Iliad, where they take a bunch of bulls and scatter them with grains before they slaughter them. You saw it with the Taurobolium in ancient Greece, where they would slaughter the bull and initiate people with the blood. There's implications of it in the Mithraeum and the Mithraic mysteries and what they call the Tauroctony. But this act of slaying a sacred bull, that through that slaying, because they represent the first crops and the first fruit, contributes to a good crop and a good fruit, a good harvest. So it takes you all the way back around through the byways of the, and you can get a lot of this bovine symbolism stuff in Jamie Paul Lamb's first book, Myth, Magic, and Masonry, which he really does a lot to explore the bovine undercurrents behind Masonry, particularly the Anno Lucius, our system of dating, which we date in the era of the Eon of Taurus. But I'll leave that. Y'all definitely get Jamie on your show if you hadn't had him.
It was a good talk with him. Yeah.
But yeah, so the bottom line is there's something else going on, and it has a lot to do with this sacrifice of a grain sacrifice, and of course, I try and explain that even further in my book, and I still don't think I've satisfactorily explained it. I just pointed out the oddity of it mainly. Because it's strange. Why would these inconsistencies be in the Masonic ritual? And what are
I'd heard as well from other people that if you come up on inconsistencies, that's where you need to stop and go down rabbit holes. And
the main thing to get us to look at are the mystery traditions that preceded us, that were encircled around these bovine cults, that is connected with our Anno Lucius in this age of Taurus, specifically the idea that we were preceded, at least in spirit, by the Mithraic mysteries, by the Sibylline mysteries, by any number of these mysteries that were centered around grain and that might sound strange, but you think about Osiris. You know, Osiris is a solar god, but he's also a green god, which is why he has a green face. You know, he represents the connection between the sun that pulls that grain up out of the ground, the connection between astrotheology and agrotheology. And I'm sure you've seen the correlations between the Hiramic legend and the ties to the Osiris myth and the acacia tree there, and similarities. So I think that's the ultimate takeaway that I put in the book. My best takeaway was that it was trying to get us to look at these traditions that preceded us.
That's awesome. So tell us about the book you're working on now again.
Well, okay, so my first book, you know, I was able to point out this secret tradition behind the everyday facade of 18th century Freemasonry, where they were using acacia in a psychedelic context to initiate their candidates. But I couldn't show how that got there. So through, you know, what we spoke about earlier with the Royal Society and Dr. John Dee and Edward Kelly, I came to find this lineage, you know, that essentially went from Edward Kelly. He allegedly discovered a red powder along with a book called the Book of Dunstan. Saint Dunstan was he was head over the abbey at Glastonbury, and it's in the Glastonbury ruins where, according to Fulcanelli, Kelly found this red powder in this book. Well, he believes that this red powder is the philosopher's stone. It's or at least the prima materia, and he believes the book will tell him how to make it. And so he goes in search of the greatest alchemist he knows at the time, which is Dr. John Dee. Unbeknownst to him, John Dee has already kind of given up on alchemy at this point and is more interested in politics and communicating with angels for the purpose of manipulating world politics. He's not really interested in alchemy. So when Kelly shows up, he finds this out and finds out that Dee needs a scryer. And Dee has already tried a couple of scryers, and they don't work out. He's not impressed, and he sends them away. And Kelly shows up and immediately dazzles him with communications with angels. And these communications go on for 7 years. They take them all over the globe, talking with different royalties. But the bottom line is Elias Ashmole, who was a member of the Royal Society, one of the early executive he was John Dee's biographer. And he was the first person to document Edward Kelly's discovery of this powder and their use of it. So when he joins the Royal Society, he's already investigating it. He had been working with Dee's system. He had gotten a cache of papers that he bought from a man and been working with Dee's system for a couple of years, when he finds out that Robert Boyle, he's considered the first chemist, he was the founder of the Royal Society, is also interested in this red powder. But he's following this guy named Wenzel Saylor, this alchemist. Wenzel Saylor also is in possession of this red powder. And the Royal Society gets this letter from a man named St. George Ash, who tells them Saylor's powder was acquired through Kelly at Rudolph's court, because Kelly was Rudolph's court alchemist. So they're like, wait a minute, we're both looking for this powder. I'm looking for it to work Dee's system, because I think that's the powder this powder makes them see angels. And then he goes and tells Boyle, look, I think this powder you're looking for, it's the same powder. And in the letter, he says, well, if it's an incorporeal substance that induces communication with, if it's a corporeal substance that induces communication with incorporeal spirits, it must be a drug. And that's what sends them off on this search for different psychedelics. So the new book shows that transmission all the way from Dee and Kelly up through the Royal Society into Masonry and then beyond. Because, for example, after Ashmole gets the Royal Society in search of this powder, he appoints a man named John Pordage as the rector of this parish. Portage is considered one of the fathers of theosophy. He's a student of Jacob Burma and Johann Gichtel. Well, Portage, after he becomes rector of this parish under Ashmole, all of a sudden he and his wife start hallucinating badly. They start seeing demons in the bricks of their houses, and they're freaking out so bad they got hammers and they're chipping at their chimney trying to beat the demons out of their bricks. I mean, they are tripping. These people are losing their minds. And the theosophers, the modern theosophers, read this and they say, no, they were having actual experience of the hellish side of matter, and they were seeing and I'm like, no, these people were tripping. If it was one person, you could say, you know, even two in France, they have, there's a French term for a mental illness called folie à deux, madness shared by two. So we still can't rule out madness, and I guess we can't rule out spiritual experience. But to me, it sounds like they're tripping, seeing things that aren't there. So when I started really researching that, it turns out that he is preoccupied with a red powder, a red tincture that he's written this whole treatise about. So this red powder keeps following these people all the way from Kelly, Ashmole, Desaguliers. Now we're at Portage. Portage, it transmits from him into, I don't know if you're familiar with the Ephrata community that was founded in America, the first theosopher community under Kelpius, was his name, Kelpius and Zimmerman. Well, there was a theosophical community established there, and they had an alchemy lab that was set up, and they were all interested in this red powder and had this retreat ritual that they had gotten from, ultimately it was written by Paracelsus, but they acquired it, I believe, through Portage. And one of the guys, Renier, wants to work this ritual, and it's 40-day retreat in a cabin where you're given more and more and more and more of this red powder.
Awesome.
It tells you ritual that at one point you're going to shit the bed. You'll have to have somebody change the bed linens. It's all this nasty shit. It says your fingernails will turn black and fall off, and your skin will fall off, which I interpret as shamanic dismemberment, a phenomenon that happens with ayahuasca and DMT, where you imagine your body to be taken apart and put back together. Yeah. But so Renier, he says, I want to do this. And they tell him, no, you're not ready. You just joined the community. You haven't even studied. And he's like, well, I'll do it myself. And he takes the manuscript, goes out in the woods, builds his little hut, and starts taking it every day, doubling the dose, and completely loses his mind. The report is reproduced in a book by Sachs on early German Pietism in Pennsylvania. But he says that he completely lost his senses, that when they found him, they had to chain him up and they whipped him for days trying to get his senses back to him, and that finally he got his senses back. But if ever things get chaotic around him, he again forgets who he is and where he is, and just completely overdid it. I mean, but so if there was any question about whether or not this red powder was a drug, that should set that to rest.
Yeah.
So the newest book is kind of a quest, the whole lineage of the red powder, huh?
Yeah. So
what's it called again?
I take a step back from Masonic lodges and try and look at the problem from a global angle. And what I realized was it's an alchemical problem, not a Masonic problem. In Masonry, that's just one dip, but the line of transmission is through Western alchemy. So the title of the book is Angels in Vermilion, the Philosopher's Stone from John Dee to DMT.
Awesome. And where can people find this book?
Well, I'm still talking to a couple of different publishers, but it should be out probably about this time next year.
Awesome. And where can people find your last book?
It's on Amazon. You can get it from my publisher, which is best for me. That's The Laudable Pursuit. And that's out of Oklahoma, ran by a great guy named Jason Marshall. It's also on Barnes & Noble, and periodically you can get signed copies from me.
Awesome. This has been an amazing interview. Really liked having you on the show.
Yeah, it's
Your
been a
book
blast.
is awesome. It's a great conversation. It's nice to talk with somebody who has shared experiences.
Yeah, I love talking about this kind of stuff because it's been so taboo for decades, and
yes,
you get to feel like you're alone, and you're not alone. I mean, there are people out here exploring the depths of self and other, and we need to, like Timothy Leary said, find the others. And
Find the others.
Find the other.
That's our mission. All right, well, we're going to wrap this up because I think we went over a little time because it's a rabbit hole.
Yeah, well, that's always good then.
For sure, for sure. All right. Thanks again for joining us. Thanks to our viewers for watching us, and we appreciate everybody.
Thanks for
We'll give
having
some shout outs to all our fans and viewers. Thanks for holding it down during this crazy time. Thanks for participating and watching. Keep following us to hear about new episodes and new things that we're doing with the Mystic Lantern Lecture Series and future Esotericon.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, man.